Welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs podcast. Its 5-year mission to explore Star Trek arcs and themes, seek out new story directions, and boldly tell stories that no one has told before.
Hailing frequencies open, sir.
Oh, hang on, I got it. Close.
Welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs with our special guest today, writer Greg Cox, who has his name on some of the most important tie-in novels in the Star Trek oeuvre. Most importantly and most famously known for being a Khan Noonien Singh expert, which we will get to at some point in this discussion. Your first Star Trek novel, Assignment Earth, is to this day one of my favorites, so we'll get back to that. We'll talk about that eventually, but I want to talk about where you started as a writer, because I know it probably, like many of us, started with writing fan fiction back in the day.
This is true. In fact, a few years back when we were clearing out my parents' house, we were moving into a retirement home, I found a cache of old fan fiction I wrote like back in junior high school, which I've actually been sort of dragged out and was rereading recently, just sort of, wow, nostalgia, This was back before, honestly, I think I knew the word fan fiction. We're not talking the internet because I'm old. We're talking scribbled in my, spiral notebooks at school and tucked away in my parents' closet for decades,
And were you as varied in your interest in fan fiction back then as the input that you've had now, or did you have like one character that you wrote a lot about when you were?
Honestly, obviously, judging from high school, I was obsessed with the whole Marvel monster comics. It was Morbius the Living Vampire, Man-Thing, Man-Wolf, Werewolf by Night, Tomb of Dracula. That was the vast majority of it, although there was some Conan stories. I did my own, So a lot of, Marvel 1970s monster comics fanfic.
Yeah, I love those too. Those were some of my favorites, and it was really cool to see Tomb of Dracula get exploded through the Blade universe when that happened. But as a science fiction writer too, you are a part of the grand tradition with the Clarion Writers Workshop, which is something that I think is kind of unique with your career being a lot of tie-in novels. I don't know how many of the tie-in writers have Clarion in their back pocket. Could you talk about for the tie-in fans who might not know what Clarion is, give them a little heads up on what Clarion is?
Yeah, there's actually two Clarions. There was the original Clarion, which was on the East Coast, and then there was Clarion West, which is obviously the sort of, West Coast adjunct. And yeah, no, it is an intensive 6-week science fiction and fantasy writing workshop that has been going strong now since the late 70s, early 80s. Sadly, they had to postpone it this summer, but I think this summer was the first summer where, pandemic, they have not been held. And the idea is that each week is taught by a different, professional science fiction writer and, or editor. And they have a distinguished lineup of writers. In my year, which was 1984, and you mentioned tie-ins, my teachers included David Hartwell, a celebrated science fiction editor, who is in fact the guy who launched the Star Trek book program at Timescape/Pika Books back in the 70s. Vonda McIntyre, who wrote the novelizations of The Wrath of Khan, Search for Spock, Voyage Home, as well as, The Entropy Effect, was one of the early original primal Star Trek authors. And Norman Svinrad, who in fact wrote the screenplay for The Doomsday Machine. So yeah, I like to joke that I'm second generation Star Trek writer here because I was actually trained by David Hartwell, Vonda McIntyre, Norman Svinrad. Not that I remember necessarily talking about Star Trek with them, though I do remember talking movie novelizations with Vonda once because she, the same summer or so, around the same time that with the Clarion, she wrote the novelization of The Bride, which was this god-awful remake of The Bride of Frankenstein, starring Jennifer Beals and Sting, you know. But I remember I was young and naive. I asked her what she thought of the movie, and then she told me she'd never seen the movie, and I was young and naive enough to be startled.
Right.
I now understand now, I now get the same response from people. Well, no, I didn't see the movie before I wrote the book, you know. I remember being young and naive enough to be startled to find out that Vonda had not actually seen the movie before writing the novelization.
Right.
But yeah, so there's a, you know,
Yeah, that's quite a
I've got Star Trek writers in my, you know, in my roots here, you know.
yeah, that's quite a group at Clarion. And by the way, Clarion is now Clarion West is now here in San Diego, where I live, and so we benefit by having every year when Clarion is being held in San Diego, we have off campus events for Clarion at Mysterious Galaxies, which is our science fiction bookstore. And so there's nightly, there's a couple nights a week where they have events that are open to the public in San Diego that are Clarion events. The authors that come to teach at Clarion usually do a signing at Mysterious Galaxies.
That was always the policy up in Seattle. Actually, I'm behind the times. I did not realize. I thought Clarion West was still operating out of Seattle. Okay.
No, we're at it's at University of California, San Diego now.
I am behind the times.
Yeah.
By the way, you mentioned Vonda McIntyre.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if people know this, but she actually left her literary estate to Clarion West.
Wow, that is amazing.
She passed away sadly a few years ago, and she actually left her literary estate. Clarion West is the executor of her estate now.
Wow, that is really cool. Well, and one of the reasons why it ended up here was the influence of another Clarion graduate, Kim Stanley Robinson, brought it to his alma mater, is how it ended up here, and with the support of other UCSD science fiction writers like David Brin, and partially because it ended up in San Diego because we're the home of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for the Human Imagination. So here, and so we get all kinds of awesome events because of Clarion and because of the Arthur C. Clarke Center. We're very spoiled in San Diego, much like you were back in the day in Seattle.
Exactly. Even I only attended in '84, but you know, during all the years thereafter, yeah, every summer there would be the Clarion West readings where there's a chance to go see Octavia Butler or Joanna Russ or whoever, you know.
Oh, that's awesome.
I was, you know, would regularly attend those things. And plus, of course, the parties.
Yeah, and since our theme is mostly going to be Star Trek, and I do want to talk about some of the other stuff that you wrote too, but we're a Star Trek storytelling podcast, and the theme of this show is I wanted to talk about how this show started. Is that I noticed that when a lot of fans were commenting on Star Trek, they were emotionally reacting to things they liked or didn't like, but they weren't thinking about Star Trek as storytelling, or Star Trek in the sense of how you tell an arc in classic storytelling form. And I wanted to do a podcast that broke down and looked at Star Trek from a storytelling perspective. So that's the way that we're going to approach this. And I'm wondering how that experience at Clarion, which of course is, like you said, you didn't talk about Star Trek there. You probably
there wasn't really much talk about doing licensed stuff, you know.
Right. And you're talking about general science fiction, but I'm sure that this experience of being at Clarion had a huge impact on how you thought of storytelling arcs. Can you talk about that experience at Clarion and how it maybe affected recent projects, whether it was Batman, Iron Man, or Star Trek, where you're thinking back and saying, like, Clarion had a huge impact on me in that way?
Oh yeah, Clarion changed my life as well. And not just because that's where I met David Hartwell, and David Hartwell was the guy who mentored me and persuaded me to move to the East Coast and, you know, take this publishing thing seriously. The phrase "wasting your life in Seattle" may have been used, you know. But anyway, I should probably mention, I mentioned that 3 of my writer instructors that year were the ones who had direct Star Trek connections, who were, you know, Vonda, Norman Spinrad, and David Hartwell. I should give credit to the other 3 professors who were the late editor Terry Carr, Susan McKee Charnas, who is a brilliant writer of science fiction and fantasy, and also Arthur Byron Cover, who, among other things, wrote the novelization of Flash Gordon. So yeah, another one of my instructors. I don't remember talking all that much about the novelization process of art, but you know, it was there. But yeah, stuff I learned at Clarion I use every day, because indeed, storytelling is storytelling to a certain degree. You know, whether you're writing Planet of the Apes, whether you're writing Star Trek, whether you're writing CSI, or your own original stuff, honestly, basically, I take the same approach, the same techniques, you know. But one of the things I use pretty much weekly is what I call Terry's rule. And Terry Carr, who was a famous science fiction editor, taught us that if you're looking to figure out who the point of view character is in any given scene, find the character who is under the most stress, emotionally or physically. And honestly, this is one of my guiding principles. I use this, you know, like weekly. It's like, and 99% of the time, unless there's some particular reason why you can't go into some character's head for fear of giving away the fact that he's really the long lost heir or whatever, that's how it works. Indeed, when I'm doing a movie novelization, one of the first things I'll do is I'll give me a script. I'll go through it with Post-its, and I'll figure out who the point of view character is in every given scene. And chances are I'm going to use what I think of as, you know, Terry's rule to figure out, okay, this scene is about Alfred. This scene is about Robin. This scene is about, you know, whatever. Which character is frankly under the most stress, and, you know, which reminds me, indeed, point of view. I'm all about point of view. Something I learned from Susan McKee Charnas was if you're struggling with a scene and it's really not working, chances are possibly you're telling the scene from the point of view of the wrong character. Oh, this isn't Dimitri's scene after all. I should be telling this scene from Nadia's point of view. And, oh, suddenly the scene works, which is another principle that, again, I've been carrying with me since I went to Clarion in '84. So I don't want to do the math, but that was a long time ago. But these are, you can see, principles are still in my head. I remember Norman Spinrad was very big in teaching us how to outline novels. This, again, was not done in the context of tie-ins, but that's very, very useful when writing Star Trek novels because, you know, there's a lot of debate about pantsers versus plotters. If you're writing a tie-in novel for a licensee, they're not going to say, oh, I'm just going to make it up as I go along. No, you have to write an outline and a proposal and run it by CBS for their approval. So, yeah, I remember Norman spent most of his week teaching us how to outline a novel, which is coming very useful because, like I said, you can't write a Batman novel or a Planet of the Apes novel or a Star Trek novel unless you put together a 15-page outline to run it by the licensor. So you can just say, oh, I got a vague idea here, I'm just going to wing it. No, there is no winging it in tie-in novels, Star Trek novels.
Right, and it's funny because Terry Carr I just finished recording an episode of my other podcast, the Dickheads podcast, Phil K. Dick, and we were talking about Terry Carr, and that one because he was the editor of the book that we were breaking down, the Ganymede Takeover, and there was a lot of, he had rejected Philip K. Dick's title for the book, which is not surprising because Ace changed almost the title of every single Philip K. Dick book over the years. They were always terrible. And it's cool for me because you're talking about a lot of writers and editors that I have a lot of respect for. David Hartwell is, of course, the editor at Tor for many years and edited the Repairman Jack series, which is one of my all-time favorite series. And Norman Spinrad is an absolute, like you and I've talked online before about Spinrad. I am a massive Norman Spinrad fan, and the idea of being able to sit down and talk about outlining with Norman Spinrad sounds totally amazing to me because I am an outliner religiously. So I appreciate that. And Star Trek fans will know Norman Spinrad as the guy who created the Doomsday Machine, which is a very important episode. One of my favorites, as a matter of fact. And he had the chance to, with like a lot of writers, they pitched ideas for Star Trek episodes that never got made. As many, they would have 4 or 5 episodes that they pitched that never got made as much as, they didn't. So, and eventually when we get more into, I'm sure you have some ideas for novels that you never got to do, just like they did. And, but just to close out talking about Clarion, was your goal when you went to Clarion, did you have a firm idea in mind what you were going to do with your career? And was it very different from how it turned out? Because I'm assuming that because of the way you explained how Hartwell said, like, come to New York, I'm assuming you were planning on writing original science fiction novels when you went to Clarion.
By the time I went to Clarion, I was deep into my starving author phase. I actually had already sold a handful of short stories. I was working at the SeaTac airport bussing tables while selling just enough stories to Amazing Stories, Mike Shane Mystery Magazine, to keep me going. And yeah, I think my ultimate plan was to be a science fiction writer. I was doing it from, like I said, while bussing tables and washing dishes in Seattle, and putting my stories into manila envelopes and mailing them off, hopefully. But David felt very strongly that I should actually uproot myself, move to New York City, and get heavily involved in publishing, work in publishing. Maybe I think the major change, I wasn't really thinking in terms of moving to publishing and becoming an editor. And in fact, I was for a long time a full-time 9-to-5 editor of Tor Books. I, while writing, doing some writing on the side, I kind of started out as a writer, then became an editor who did a little writing on the side, and gradually segged from being, like I said, an editor who wrote tie-in novels on the side to being a tie-in writer who still does a little editing on the side. I'm still a consulting editor for Tor Books, and I'm, in fact, tomorrow morning I'm getting up and I have to edit a manuscript for Tor. So, but yeah, David was the one who said, no, seriously, if you're really serious about this, move to New York City, get in publishing, meet people, do things. Don't just kind of, hang out here in Seattle and go to conventions, and bus tables, In fact, I'll tell you a true story. If you can, I don't know if you can edit this or not. I joke, my first job in publishing was as David Hartwell's nanny. True story. David was trying to urge me. It actually took him a couple of years to get me to move because I was, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. My friends were there. My family was there. I'd never been further than, Spokane, Washington. The idea of just up and moving to New York City was insane. But eventually I kind of came around to the idea I should do this. Okay, I was unemployed. I was, So I actually wrote a letter to David by snail mail. This was before email. Saying, okay, David, if I was to do this, how would I even do this? What, just get on a bus and move to New York? What do I do? David called me back about a week later, because snail mail, and said, hey, Greg, by coincidence, my nanny just quit. If you can get out here in a week, I'll give you free room and board. You can take care of my kids, and I'll introduce you around New York Publishing and find you a job. And I packed up my life, got on a plane. David met me at the airport, and indeed, I was his nanny. I'm still friends with his kids, who are now fully grown. And indeed, David, in fact, took me around, introduced me to editors and things, and got me my first job, which was as an editorial assistant at Arbor House.
Well, his influence on John J. Ordiver, who we've already had on the podcast, was very clear that he brought John in as well, who became, kind of ran the show there for the Star Trek novels for many years. And so I think David Hartwell's influence on the Star Trek novels obviously is huge and important because he launched the line at Timescape, because there were Star Trek novels before that, the Bantam ones. I think most people, I like some of the Bantam ones because they feel weird and odd in the Star Trek universe because all they had for canon at the time was the original series. So that makes them interesting. And there are some big names who wrote Star Trek novels in that era, like your Joe Handelmans and
Greg Benford.
Yeah, Benford and Greg Bear, I think. Although that was Timescape.
Corona, yeah.
And so you had some pretty big names in science fiction that were writing them, and I think that that's a difference between the way that the Ordover era kind of changed it over, is where it became a stable of Star Trek writers, whereas in the past we had, like, some writers who were kind of moonlighting in Star Trek. And I think that there's pluses and minuses to that, in the sense that some of those older books are a little weirder, but it's definitely true that you guys who write in Star Trek regularly have a great understanding of the canon that makes the reader feel very comfortable. At least it seems to me. So let's get into writing Star Trek. Was Assignment Earth your first Star Trek novel, or no?
No, that was my fourth.
Your fourth, okay.
Fourth.
I thought that was your first. So what was your first Star Trek novel, and take us into the process of how you got that job?
When possible, such confusion. Honestly, a Return to Gary 7 book was the very first idea I ever pitched to Pocket Books. It ended up being my fourth book.
Yeah.
In fact, I pitched it originally to Kevin Ryan, who was John Ordover's predecessor.
Right.
We should probably make it clear, it wasn't just, we didn't go from David Hartwell to John Ordover. There was Mimi Panic, there was Dave Stern, there was Kevin Ryan, and then subsequently Marco Palmieri, Margaret Clark, Ed Sussinger. There has been
a line.
Generations of Star Trek editors, yeah. But yeah, I got brought in during the Ordover era, we might call it. But prior to that, I had actually submitted a Return of Gary 7 novel, which was very different from the final version, to Kevin Ryan, which he looked at and passed on for reasons.
Mm-hmm.
My first book was, in fact, a Deep Space Nine novel, Devil in the Sky.
Yes,
which I co-wrote
Ordover talked about that one in his interview.
Which I co-wrote with John Gregory Betancourt.
Mm-hmm.
My second one was also a collaboration. That was Dragon's Honor, which was a Next Generation novel, which I wrote with Kiz Johnson, who, by the way, also has Clarion West roots. Small world. Mm-hmm. My first original or solo Star Trek novel, it was a Voyager novel, The Black Shore.
I remember that one, yeah.
And then finally, I got to write the Gary 7 novel I wanted to write in the first place, which was Assignment Eternity, which is a TOS novel featuring the return of Gary 7, Roberta Lincoln, and Isis the Cat,
Mm-hmm. So this one that you originally pitched, how different was it from Assignment Earth?
Wildly different. I remember it had pretty much the same opening scene, which was the Gary 7 and Roberta emerging from the swirling blue mist of their sort of swirling blue mist teleporter. No, it had something else. It had to do with some college university. There was someone who was building a secret super weapon that was intended to destroy the Organians and therefore disrupt the Organian peace treaty. This is a long time ago, but yeah. Basically, I had the idea of wanting to bring back Gary 7 in that crowd, but it had the same title too, because Assignment Eternity just seemed like a great title. But no, the final version, after going through various different versions, ended up being a whole different story.
Oh, I said Assignment Earth, which was the TOS episode.
I get that mixed up sometimes too. Yeah, the episode was Assignment Earth. My book is Assignment Eternity. And I swear to God, I had completely forgotten that there's a Heinlein novel called Assignment in Eternity. That was a homage to the Heinlein novel, right? No, I completely forgot about the Heinlein title.
Well, and it must have been really cool to work with Gary 7 as a character, which was originally intended to be a backdoor pilot for a spinoff show. It's the one that really, I had read Black Shores. Now, just to give you some background for me, I eventually burned out on Star Trek novels, where I told myself I had to take a break, because the late 90s, during the Ordover era, it's one of the reasons why I had to interview him. I was in college, and the only fiction I read outside of anything that was assigned to me through college, I read Star Trek novels to and from school. I had a very long bus ride to college, and I would read Star Trek novels to and from. And I read over, during the Ordover era, there was about 100 at that time, and I read them all. And
well, back in the 90s, we were putting out 2 a month.
Right.
There were 2 a month. So
yeah, and I was getting every single one of them as soon as they came out, and I was reading them all. And Assignment Eternity was one of those ones that I considered because I read all of them and I enjoyed them to a certain degree, all of them. But Assignment Eternity was one of those ones where I was like, okay, now I got to pay attention to this guy because this guy is writing on another level that I really like. And
Yeah.
so, for example, when it got announced that you were doing the Eugenics Wars books, I was like, oh yeah, this guy can do this. Because, you know, and it's interesting because, and I want to get back into the writing process of collaborating in those early ones, but while we're continuing to talk about Gary Seven, you had to have felt like a specific weight, like doing this character. It must have been really exciting too.
Well, I think, like I said, because that original episode was clearly intended as a pilot, and it ends with Spock saying, "I think we can tell them they're going to have many interesting adventures." I think as a kid, I always felt cheated that we never got to see those, subsequent interesting adventures. I mean, that episode kind of ends with the promise of more Gary Seven, Roberta Lincoln adventures, which we never got. So I finally just had to write them myself,
Mm-hmm.
That scratched an itch from, like childhood,
Was there ever any talk of like writing Gary Seven novels that didn't involve the Enterprise? Because like I think that they're very doable, right?
I don't remember us ever, having a serious discussion about it. I know they've been a staple of the books. Dayton Ward has also been using Gary Seven and Roberta, in some of his books. Dayton was very nice once. I told the story. He actually called me, which he was not obliged to do because I don't own Gary Seven, obviously.
Right.
Hey, Greg, I'm thinking of doing something with Gary Seven. Am I going to be stepping on your toes? Actually, at the moment that I had done 3 Gary Seven books, I had nothing immediately lined up. I was like, no, he's go with God.
Fair game.
He was not obliged to ask for my blessing, but it was very nice of him to make sure that we weren't to be stepping on each other's toes,
Oh, that's very cool.
Pick up the ball, Gary Seven, run with it. I'm busy. I was busy with other projects. I had no immediate plans to get back to them.
No, so those first 2 collaborations, John talked about how the Horta novel, The Devil in the Sky, was really important because you guys didn't really know a lot about the Deep Space Nine characters at that time. And he said he wanted to really connect to the Star Trek universe. So the way he kind of said it is, it's like that he called you guys up and was basically like, hey, write a Horta. Can you write Hortas on Deep Space Nine? That must have been really fun too.
Yeah, John, I should mention again, it's a small world. I knew John because we had worked together on the New York Review of Science Fiction, which was a magazine published by David Hartwell. John and I were also both assistant editors at Tor Books together. We actually shared a cubicle. So before he went over to Star Trek, we pretty much shared a cubicle. So he knew that I was a Trekkie. In fact, I think he and I went and saw Star Trek V together before either of us were professionally connected with Star Trek. So we were fan buddies. John had to get a whole Deep Space Nine line launched very quickly. That's how a lot of us got our foot in the door, because suddenly they had a stable of writers, but suddenly, we need a whole lot more writers because the regular stable were already committed doing TOS and TNG books. So John was basically working his Rolodex trying to find DS9 writers. And he was coming up with the ideas himself, because indeed, we did, at that point, the show had not debuted. And John, I was saying, Double Sky, that was very much his idea. He had not just the Hortas. He said, here's the idea. He had a basic setup. They're transporting Horta eggs. They get loose. Baby Hortas are overrunning the station. Can you do that? And he called me and John Betancourt, because John and I, the other John, Betancourt and I, had recently collaborated on a couple of Batman stories, which Ordover had read and enjoyed. So he thought, Greg and Betancourt are a team. They did those Batman things together. Maybe they can do this Deep Space Nine thing together. So he basically, and then he sent us, and all we had to work with in the beginning was this little short, writer's Bible, and the script for the first episode.
Eventually, work with.
Now eventually, thank God, the show started airing while we were writing the show. So I got Plus, I was devouring Starlog and reading everything I could about the show. But you know, we plotted the outline. We were well into writing the book before we ever saw a frame of it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I have a story about that because, again, we had very little to go on. To this day, people occasionally complain that Kira is too mean to Bashir in that book.
Mm-hmm.
And I point out that at that point, all I had was the script for the first episode.
Right.
And if you remember, in the first episode, she pretty much tears him a new one the first time they meet, you know. So I picked up on that and ran with it because that was the only dynamic I had. Oh, Bashir meets Kira, she doesn't like him, and she tears him a new one. So we ran with that. Little do we know that they, you know, of course, now people read it. Why is Kira so mean to her best friend Bashir? We had that one scene to go on. And I remember being very frustrated that we had no handle on who Dax was whatsoever. I could not figure out what Dax, I'm convinced Dax didn't get a discernible personality until season 2. And I remember we actually kind of wrote around Dax to the point where Ordover actually had to call us and tell us, oh, why is Dax not in this book? And we're like, we can't figure out who Dax is and what her shtick is. I will mention also that how we divvied up the writing, basically all the stuff on the station I wrote. All the stuff on the away team, Betancourt wrote. So that way we didn't have to constantly coordinate. I'm doing, you know, the plot on the station. He's got one set of characters. He's got it on the away thing. And then we got together one snowy weekend. I remember it was snowing, and brought the two storylines together and wrote them to put the conclusion together.
That's a really interesting method of doing that because and that's something that's common in that era, the Berman era of Star Trek, is the A storyline and the B storyline. And yeah,
I had previously done another collaboration on another project with another author where we tried to just sort of trade back and forth. I'll do the odd chapters, you do the even ones. Never do this. It was a disaster because we were constantly trying to, okay, does the character have shoes? What's the weather like? Like, this was much easier to, hi. He could go away, do his thing. I could go away, do my thing. They were out of radio contact with each other. We didn't have to, you know. And to a certain degree, I feel like there are characters I didn't really write. He had Kira, he had Bashir and Dax. So there's a part of me that says I barely didn't write those characters. Those were.
But you came back to Deep Space Nine eventually at some point, right? And
that remains my only Deep Space Nine book.
Oh, really? That's interesting. So you must have had an interesting relationship with Deep Space Nine because, and I'm sure you saw Voyager too, the scripts for Voyager before you ever got to see the show too, right?
Same situation. I had an outline and I had the script for Caretaker. That's all I had.
Right. And so it must have been interesting as a storyteller to see how they developed these shows from that aspect. Do you think that changes or colors your view of those shows as a whole?
I don't know. I mean, I have memories about them, and as you get further away from writing it, it's not, you know, I'm sure the first time around I was watching the first season of Deep Space Nine with a notepad and my, madly scribbling notes and, and checking out the art direction and figuring out what everything looked like. Nowadays, I'm 20 years removed. I think I can just sort of watch the episodes on their own terms more. It's the same thing with movie novelizations. I find the first time I see a movie that I've novelized, all I'm seeing is all the stuff I got wrong. Oh, that's what that looks like. Oh, they cut that scene. It takes a couple of viewings before I can just sort of sit back and enjoy it on its own terms rather than comparing it to the novelization I wrote. No one told me that character was a woman, that kind of thing. You know?
So did you have any interesting things with writing that Voyager with Black Shores, like with writing that? Like what you were saying, when you didn't know Dax at all, like what challenges were there for Voyager when you were?
Well, I remember John Ordover was telling us to think in terms of the Odyssey. I remember what he didn't want was, again, John was very hands-on. John loves plotting. He's very much collaborative. It was very much a collaborative process. He did not want, he put in Gilligan's Island plots, where, it looks like they're going to get home, but they don't,
Yeah.
He said, think of it, the Odyssey. It's a long 40-year voyage. And so indeed, Black Shore is basically lifted pretty shamelessly from Circe, the Lorelei, the Lotus Eaters segment of the Odyssey from Homer. Okay, this seemingly idyllic place with lots of temptations that kind of sucks them in for a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of a classic.
And
That's a classic original series kind of storyline too, with This Side of Paradise and that kind of thing. So I think it fits into the Star Trek canon really well. So.
Well, in fact, true story, my original, not very imaginative title for that book was Paradise.
Right.
But then Ordover pointed out that the preceding book was by Melissa Scott, I believe, was called The Garden. He didn't want to go to that well quite too often. So I had to come up with The Black Shore, which honestly I think is a much better title. But
now,
if you indulge me, I got one more story. How these things happen sometimes.
Take your time. We want to hear.
Yeah, I have no, but okay. So in The Black Shore, people who have not read it, they basically land on tropical paradise planet that has a terrible secret. But okay, where was I when I was plotting this book? John contacted me, told me he wanted me to, much as with Deep Space Nine, hi, we got to get a lot of Voyager books, we're in a hurry, here's the Bible, here's the outline, think it over this weekend and call me on Monday. I was actually attending a tour sales conference in Marco Island, Florida. So literally I'm lying out on a beach chair, under, a umbrella, sipping a drink with a little umbrella in it. Okay, God, I promised John an idea by Monday. I'm looking around, beaches, palm trees, Literally, I was sitting on a beach at a beach resort at a tour sales conference in Marco Island, Florida, which is where I got the idea for The Black Shore.
Oh, that's funny. And so, and writing those characters, I think, well, look, Voyager has a connection for me in the sense that Catherine Janeway and I share a same hometown, Bloomington, Indiana. And in fact, on this podcast, I interviewed the people who raised the money and built the monument that's debuting here in a couple, 2 months, the Janeway Monument in Bloomington. And so I think Voyager has a special place for us Hoosiers because she's not only from Indiana, but specifically that monument is 2 blocks from the last house I lived in Bloomington before I left. And so I have a special place in my heart for Voyager, and Voyager was really important for Paramount because they were launching the network. So one of the things that Robert Hewitt Wolf told us was that Voyager got all the promotion money and Deep Space Nine was always kind of the stepchild that, but for that reason they got ignored and they were able to do some more interesting storylines.
Less scrutiny.
It's funny because you guys were always kind of writing tiny novels. You're always trapped into, you can't make major changes to the lead characters. So you kind of almost always have to create characters that come in and out of these novels as, when you're doing it. But I would imagine when you're doing these projects with Voyager and Deep Space Nine, when it's the original, you also can't really introduce a lot of those because you don't know where the show's going at that point. What are the specific challenges of writing a show that's just developing?
Well, it is trickier because I used to refer to it as the Smokey the Bear syndrome, in that you have to leave the campsite the way you found it. But yeah, it's easier when you're doing TOS where, okay, those 79 episodes are burned into my brain forever. We know it's all worked out. And there's not going to be any surprises here, But yeah, you're still kind of trying to, the show is still filling its way. Again, like I said, I'll confess, I did not have a handle on Dax when we wrote that Voyager book. And fortunately, I didn't have to deal with it because Dax got handed off and on Voyager, again, I felt I had a better grasp of some of the characters than others.
They're a little bit more Starfleet,
What's that?
They're a little bit more Starfleet. So,
oddly enough, I wrote one of the Kess-centric novels, before, it got in. little knowing that she was going to be going away. And honestly, I will say, I don't think, honestly, I had a real good handle on Janeway.
Mhm.
At that point in my career, I'll be confessing, I was still struggling with how to deal with the captains. I had the same problem with Cisco Deep Space Nine, because it seems to me the captain, if the captains are competent, they're busy delegating, and other people they're not getting themselves into danger unless they're Kirk, But so I remember sort of struggling with Cisco in Devil in the Sky. I remember struggling with Janeway, because you want to get the captain there, you want them involved in the action, but you don't want them to seem so incompetent because things are falling apart under them. So I tended to honestly zero in on the O'Briens and the Kesses and the Balanas and the lower level characters who, for whatever reason, at that point in my career, I was much more comfortable writing with. But wait a minute, the captain's in charge. They should just be sitting in a bridge delegating and not actually be in trouble. And wait a minute, the captain's really on the ball. Things shouldn't get to the point where the ship's going to blow up anyway. So I struggled a bit with the authority figures, and I had much more fun writing the lower ranks characters. I remember I had a ball writing Jake and Nog on Deep Space Nine,
Mhm.
and I had a lot of fun with Chip. If you notice, the climax of it, as I recall, it's been ages. Black Shore, the climax, it's Kess and it's Neelix and it's B'Elanna. I sort of like the lower level, more colorful characters than the authority figures. I was still kind of struggling with how to write authority figures back then.
And how did you crack the captains? Like, what's the code there? Because I think that's an interesting, and that's, I think, the dilemma that happened with Picard when the show premiered, is and Last Jedi, frankly, and that's what kicked off this podcast. Is because what started this podcast is I did a commentary on why I thought Picard as a show was learning the right lessons from Last Jedi, and I knew that that was like kind of kicking over a hornet's nest. But for me, you can't write a story arc unless you have flaws, and people had this unreal idea that they didn't want Luke Skywalker to have any flaws. They didn't want Jean-Luc Picard to have any flaws. And people were just aghast that the Starfleet Admiral was like the sheer fucking gall at Jean-Luc Picard. And I think you're hinting at that, is that you kind of came to that conclusion, or you worked out those issues.
In my early days, I was struggling with that, about how to make these characters screw up enough that the ship would be in danger without sort of, and again, sort of thinking that they should be authoritative and issuing orders, and, that's not, again, Jake and Nog can run around and get into trouble. It was harder to write Cisco running around and get in trouble. Mm-hmm. Chief O'Brien can get exasperated and, have his wonderful everyman quality. Quark can, be unscrupulous. Like I said, I remember, it's been years since I've read these books, but I suspect I underutilized Cisco and Janeway, in all honesty, in those books. And I preferred to focus on the lower level, more flawed, fallible characters,
Mm-hmm. Well, and I do think that, there is the struggle with that, but at the same time, like, if you look at if you really sit down and think about the original series, how many times Kirk would have had to have sent a subspace message home to a family to say, like, I'm sorry that we lost your poor red shirt loved one. There was probably going to be a lot of them. And,
I will say, of all the captains, Kirk is the easiest and arguably the most fun to write. Because, again, there's a precedent. You don't have to come up with explanation as to why he's beaming down into danger. That's Kirk. Oh, we got a distress signal. He's going to beam down. Okay,
Yeah.
And I think you don't have to justify that to a degree. That's sort of Kirk's nature. He's going to be in the front of everything, and he's going to be in the thick of things, and
Mm-hmm.
I think the trick, honestly, is to get the captains off the bridge as fast as humanly possible. You don't want them sitting around in conference rooms. You don't want them sitting on the bridge, just sort of, sitting in a chair, looking at a view screen, issuing orders. If you can get Picard off the ship and stick him into a swamp full of alligators, okay, suddenly, that's the way to do it. Okay, have him kidnapped by Cardassians or something, or just, having to deal with Q. The nice thing about Q is Q renders, Picard infinitely frustrated, because all you can really do when Q is messing with you is just kind of go along with it, and roll with the punches.
You wrote 3 Q novels. And that's a challenge as far as writing an omnipotent
Yeah.
villain is very hard, especially over a trilogy. Like that must have been a particular challenge there.
Especially since, honestly, that was like my first trilogy. I'd never actually written a trilogy before. And there was a learning curve there. I'm being brutally honest here. There was a learning curve as to how to figure out how to plot a book over 3 books, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well,
But again, the nice thing was actually Picard, like I said, loses control of the situation very easily when Q is in charge, because you can't just sort of quote Starfleet regulations and issue orders. Okay, with Q, you just kind of have to roll with the punches, you know.
Well, and
Q can say things that no other Star Trek character can say, you know, which I love writing Q because he's so snarky and irreverent, and he can actually just he can insult Riker to his face. It's wonderful. He can make me be flippant and, you know, irreverent, you know.
Was that trilogy something that you pitched, or was that one that was brought to you by Ordover, whoever was editing at the time?
It was Ordover's idea, although all he had, what he gave me was he thought the Q Continuum was a great name for a trilogy. So he said, Greg, I want you to write a trilogy, and I want the title to be the Q Continuum.
Right.
Everything else, no, obviously, once I got writing the thing and I sent him outlines, we went back and forth and give and take. But no, he didn't have, unlike, say, Devil in the Sky, where he was like, you know, Baby Hortus eating the station. He had clear vision in his head. There was, I want a trilogy about Q. We're going to call it the Q Continuum, because continuing.
Mm.
What have you got, Greg? So when I went off and I came up with a whole plot, and then we, you know, and then as always, it's a collaborative process. I wrote an outline. John and I went back and forth, and we sent it to CBS, and they had, actually Paramount back then, and they had their comments and do this, don't do this, and, you know,
input. Yeah, at the time, had Voyager already done its last Q episode?
No, and I lived in mortal terror of Voyager running a Q episode, which would invalidate my entire plot as I was writing it, you know.
That's interesting. I know I read those, but the storyline for those is not coming back to my head. But I remember enjoying them. And I also remember thinking to myself that at the time, before I read your Q trilogy, I remember having the thought that I didn't think anybody should go back to Q in the novels after Peter David did such a great job with the Q squared, and then remember being pleasantly surprised that I felt like you found new ground to go to. And at that time too, you guys were such an interesting community of writers that, and I asked John this, and he told me, he's like, you're gonna have to ask one of the writers, and he specifically told me, you should have Greg on. And because I was wondering, like, you had such a friendly seeming community. I've seen pictures of you guys together. Were you guys at all competitive with each other in a fun way, or
not really? No, like I said, it is a really a friendly community. We actually had a Zoom reunion the school. We had a Zoom reunion a few weeks ago. We just hung out and chatted for 2 hours, you know, because we're not seeing each other at conventions.
Right.
I like to refer to Shore Leave, which is a Star Trek convention in Hunt Valley, Maryland, as our annual high school reunion, because we all show up and, you know. And just to the vagaries of the alphabet, I quite often at book signings find myself seating next to Peter David, because, you know, so yeah, I know Peter and Kathleen, and, you know, going back years. And no, every so often I'll see a project and think, oh damn, that's a great idea. I should have thought of that one. Or, oh, I was meaning to do a sequel to that episode. Though at this point, honestly, I think we've mined the original 79 episodes. I don't think, you know, aside from doing a sequel to, you know, Spock's brain, I'm not sure we, you know. And by the way, I was told not to even think about that. Okay. Margaret,
yeah,
Margaret don't even think about it, Greg. She knows me too well. No, yeah. No Spock's brain sequels. Okay.
No way to Eden. Like, yeah, I'm sure there's certain episodes you just don't want to touch, and for good reason. Yeah,
Spock's there are brain. A few. Yes, I've pitched a few, and sometimes less than enthusiasm. Okay, you know.
Yeah,
But no one has ever done a sequel to that one. Yes, Greg, and there's a reason, you know.
yeah, and we'll come back to that. But I think yeah, because that's the thing is that during that era, I think that and that's one of the things that I said when I did the Ordiver interview is that it almost felt like an MCU of Star Trek. It just felt like it like at that time the books all worked so well together, and I think that the community that you guys had as writers were very important. And well, personally, you know, it's funny because I have my favorites from that era, but in the end, I think that era, I think of the books all kind of collectively in a fun way. But I think one of the towering achievements of the Ordiver era, and one that he talked a lot about developing during his time, is your not your first trilogy, but the next, I believe it was the next trilogy that you wrote, which was the Eugenics Wars. And this was very important because it also provided you the experience of being a con expert on the DVD bonus materials for Wrath of Khan. And I know because I heard you say this in another interview, and the Wrath of Khan soundtrack is, I have a, for me, when I'm writing, I have a playlist of over 500 soundtrack songs, various tracks. And anytime the Wrath of Khan music comes on, I get very emotional because Wrath of Khan is probably the movie I've seen more than any other movie in my entire lifetime. And I believe you said the same thing in an interview. And I did this when I was listening. The Eugenics Wars was an incredibly complicated story to tell, but probably a great honor to tell as well. What's the story from your perspective of doing it? Because I got John's perspective of doing the Eugenics Wars, and he talked about his phone call to Ron Moore where he said, you know, tell me, do the dates stand? Do the dates of, you know, the original series stand or not? And Ron Moore is saying, yes, the dates stand. And that instantly provided you that you had to write a novel about a war that happened in secret.
Exactly. There's when it comes to the Eugenics Wars, which famously took place in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
We all remember the Eugenics Wars of the 1990s. There's basically, there were two ways to go at it. You can just throw real history out the window, assume we're dealing with alternate history, and write a really great kick-ass military science fiction novel about the apocalyptic eugenics wars of the 1990s, which, you know, have been a valid approach. Or we could do what we did. And what John felt very strongly, he wanted that Star Trek should be our future. So we had to find a way to somehow take the eugenics wars and squish them into the 1990s we all lived through. And that meant making it, you know, basically taking the X-Files approach, that it was a secret conspiracy war that the average person did not know about. And that it was only in hindsight historians of, you know, Kirk's era could look back on that era as the eugenics wars. To the average person, it was just, oh, well, there's a revolution here, there's a civil war going here, there's a disaster over here. Oh, they were all part of this secret underground conflict between various, you know, what we now call augments. And boy, I wish I'd had the word augments back when I wrote those books, so I wouldn't have to keep writing genetically engineered superhumans all the time, you know. But yeah, so we took the approach that we were going to, and this turned into an enormous crossword puzzle. I thought of assembling that book was like a crossword puzzle, in that you had real history, you had Star Trek history, and we had to figure out the connections and make them overlap and connect. And this was a kind of a big ambitious project. I remember doing lots and lots of research. I had an entire shelf of books on the history of India, because of course Khan was raised in, you know, northern India and Rajasthan. And doing all sorts of research on this stuff. And I remember going nuts trying to find out what the Indira Gandhi Memorial Airport was called before Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and it became the Indira Gandhi Memorial Airport, you know. So yeah, a lot of historical research and everything.
Well,
although the funny thing is that all got started, and this is a true story, I don't know if John told you, with an Easter egg. At the end of Assignment Eternity, which was my Gary Seven book,
I know.
there was a throwaway line about, you know, much like the line at the end of Assignment Earth. Well, you know, Captain, according to our records, Mr. Lincoln and Miss Lincoln, you know, Gary Seven and Miss Lincoln were responsible for overthrowing, you know, Khan Noonien Singh during the eugenics wars of the 1990s. And I swear to God, I just meant that as kind of a funny throwaway. Oh, you know, hey, wouldn't it be funny if Gary Seven and Roberta were actually the people who do? And it was just meant as kind of an Easter egg at the end of that book, because, you know, they're more or less contemporaries, 20th century. Like I said, I swear to God, I had no vast plan beyond that. Was just kind of a nice little Easter egg at the end of that book, Gary Seven book. John, to his credit, Ordover, read the book and called me up, Greg, you want to write that? That sounds great. You want to write that book? You know. And before we knew it, suddenly we're on this project, and this ended up being 3 books, you know. But yeah, it was all because I had this throwaway little, you know, Easter egg at the end of Assignment Eternity that John seized on and realized, oh, wait, Greg, that's too good an idea to waste just for an Easter egg at the end of this book. You need to write this. And that turned into a, you know, the next several years were all about Khan. Okay, you know.
Right, and I will say, as a reader at the time, I had the same thought John did when I read the end of that book, and so I remember, because, you know, we used to always read in the inside covers of the Star Trek novels, which were coming later in the year, and when the Eugenics Wars was in the back cover of the book as something that was coming months ahead of time, I remember being like, yes, they did it, and I got the feeling too from talking to John that it's of the Star Trek projects that he did, it's one that he's most proud of, or it's up there as one of the ones that he has the most pride in. And I could imagine for you being that the level of research and the level of, you know, I mean, John loved, I could tell, talking about like how great Bill Clinton handled the eugenics wars was a joke that he made, and I could see where that would be one that would be very special and close to both of your hearts because of just the place it has in Star Trek history, and for you personally to get you on the Wrath of Khan DVD. You know, and I remember too that when I saw you listed on there as a fan of the Star Trek novels, that's another moment where I was like, yeah, that's really cool that they're having him, and I was really looking forward to seeing your interview there and you becoming a Khan expert. And I gotta ask, have you recently seen that? I saw IDW just recently launched a series where Khan is the hero of a mirror universe story. I thought that was really brilliant. And it's really cool to see Khan getting, you know, that kind of treatment there too. I don't know. Anyways.
Yeah. Well, no, I have heard of that. I have not yet tracked it down, but yeah. But yeah, no, that, like I said, I'll be honest, those are probably the Star Trek books I am most remembered for. Mm-hmm. I joke, I'm kind of resigned to the fact that when I die, my obituary will say Greg Cox, author of the Cod trilogy and many other Star Trek books, you know. And when I'm online on this, you know, popping around and, you know, online, so I was always like, hey, Greg Cox, are you the guy who wrote the Khan book? You know, Khan book, that, you know. It's funny, the Q books actually sold better. The Q books are still the best selling of all my Star Trek books, by the way.
Interesting. But
the when I'm at conventions, I'm doing book signings and people come up to me. Yeah, occasionally they talk to me about Dragon's Honor or The Black Shore, but it's always, it's the Khan books are, and honestly, I can live with that. That was a big project that took up, like I said, a few years and a lot of work. So yeah, I'm very pleased. I'm not complaining that. Mm-hmm. Really, that was 30 years ago that, you know, people still, oh my God, you're the Khan guy. You're the guy who wrote the Khan books. Yeah, so that's very gratifying.
Well, hey, even Stephen King says to this day, people always say The Stand is his best. And he's like, I wrote a lot of books since The Stand,
Yeah,
and
I saw an interview once, article once by Isaac Asimov, where he said he had mixed feelings when people come up to him telling him that, Nightfall is their favorite story of his. On the one hand, it was his first story. He was like, on the one hand, oh, it's great that this story is still finally remembered 50 years later. So really, everything since then has been downhill,
yeah. So I mean, if it could happen to Isaac Asimov and Stephen King, it could,
No, like I said, I'm joking here, but no, like it's amazing that those books. I kind of wrote them. 9/11 happened when I was writing with those books. There was originally going to be a scene in the Eugenics Wars where Khan blew up the World Trade Center. That scene did not happen. Okay, in my original outline, Khan was going to blow up the World Trade Center. Okay.
Interesting.
Then 9/11 happened, and we did some rapid revisions.
All right. So I want to ask a few questions about the Star Trek books that got away, and then we'll talk about the new one, because that's important too. But I love the idea, because I talked to Robert Hewitt Wolf in the last interview about some of the episodes and storylines that they approached in Deep Space Nine that they never got to do, and so I think it's, in your situation, it's got to be really hilarious because, first off, which is the most ridiculous episode of the original series that you got turned down on trying to write a sequel episode to?
Well, I'm going to give a disclaimer here that honestly, I'm often reluctant to talk about rejected projects
Because you
I'm not
might
sure how you talk about it without it sounding like sour grapes. And I had this great idea, and those, Philistines lacked the vision to see how brilliant my idea was. I mean, I've had some dumb ideas, and they've been shot down.
I think that's the thing, is I think some of the dumb ideas are fun.
I remember, I'll tell you this, John and I once had a crazy idea. We actually submitted an outline for a Charlie's Angels type book that was going to be, Aurora, Chapel, and Rand teamed up as like Kirk's Angels solving a crime on shore leave, Pocketbooks was kind of like, very funny, I think honestly, John just wanted to do a cover of them all in pose,
Right.
I wrote an outline for it. I don't even think I even have a copy of it anymore. I will say I aggressively lobbied to do a sequel.
That's fantastically ridiculous, by the way. That is fantastically ridiculous. I love it. So go ahead.
I lobbied aggressively to do a sequel to Cat's Paw because not one of everybody's favorite episodes. I love Cat's Paw irrationally. It's the Halloween. It is the Star Trek Halloween special written by Robert Bloch, author of Psycho. How can you not love that? So
we
I
talked
actually
about
really aggressively pitched a sequel to Cat's Paw. And honestly, there's two ways to do a sequel to Cat's Paw, and I chose the most ridiculous. You could just sort of follow up on the idea, well, who were those aliens? The little, spindly little, pipe cleaner aliens at the end, and what were they for? What was their culture? Or you could do what I wanted to do, which was take all the Halloween spooky stuff and dial it up to 11. So I wrote this really super gothic castle, zombies, giant black cats, super Halloween. I basically took Cat's Paw and dialed it up to 11. And I remember the response was, Cat's Paw, really? Oh, come on, please go do it. No one has ever done a sequel to Cat's Paw. Yeah, there's a reason. Yeah.
Well,
honestly, I lobbied for it very aggressively. I'm not going to say who finally vetoed it. I pushed it for a while, but like I said, I am humble enough to realize that Cat's Paw is, when people talk about the great episodes, I probably one of the few people who go Cat's Paw, and B.
Well, you're talking to another one here.
A sane, serious way to do a sequel to Cat's Paw, and then there's the dial all the monsters and ghosts and zombies and ghouls and super Halloween episode book I wanted to write. I was not interested in writing a book in which we find out that the pipe cleaner aliens are, have this culture and they're an interesting alien species. And then it's just we do first contact with the pipe cleaner aliens. No, I wanted I wanted to have Kirk fight a giant cat, but with all the special effects you could put in a novel, as opposed to sort of cheesy special effects in the old episode, you know.
Right.
But, you know, that was one that, you know,
Well,
another thing.
well, before you do that, I will say that this podcast has given lots of love to Cat's Paw because we did an episode on horror in Star Trek. And
Yes.
we talked at length about all the Robert Bloch episodes because he wrote 3 episodes that were all very horror, including the What Little Girls Were Made Of, which referenced Lovecraftian elder gods in it, and Lovecraft who and Bloch traded letters with Lovecraft. So and of course, like I've been dying for somebody to. I know it would be a logistical nightmare to actually do Lovecraftian elder gods with Star Trek, but I do think that the invasion, the 4 invasion books were as close as we're going to get to that, to the Lovecraftian things. But you were going to say another one that got away.
I will brag. I did not work on Invasion, but I wrote the back cover copy for all the Invasion books.
Mm-hmm.
Besides other things, I was writing, one of my sidelines, I write, you know, back cover copy for books. I wrote a lot of the back cover copy back during the Ordover era for other people's books, which is another way I stayed on top of what everybody else was doing, because they would send me the outlines from Mike Friedman or Peter David or Susan Wright's books. And I would write the back cover copy for them, so I kind of knew what was going on in the line at that point. But
well, that's cool. Any others that got away that would be?
Well, I can tell you one thing. I actually was invited to pitch to the Voyager TV series a couple of times. They were very nice. They graciously, hey Greg, you're a Trek writer. They graciously invited me to pitch. I never managed to actually seal the deal and sell one, but it was nice to be invited. I have for years now been recycling those rejected Voyager pitches
That's awesome.
in my prose stuff. My story in the 7 Deadly Sins anthology is a rejected Voyager pitch, which I turned into a TNG story. I wrote a novella, Miasma, came out as an ebook only special a few years ago. That was a rejected Voyager pitch, which I changed from a Voyager pitch to a TOS story. I took another rejected Voyager pitch and turned it into a Farscape story and sold it to the official Starscape magazine. So I've been
mining those for a while.
Not, you know. I don't throw out my old pitches and outlines. And in fact, the Cat's Paw outline, I can reveal this now probably, I recycled it. That's The Weight of Worlds, one of my books, The Weight of Worlds. I went through and de-Cat's Pawed it. I took out all the spooky stuff. I took out all the direct references to Cat's Paw, but the story structure, the layout of the A plot, the B plot, and what happens where, if that was the Cat's Paw book, which I then went refurbished, you know.
Oh, that's really cool. And that
I came of a new, different, hostile alien race from another dimension trying to invade our own. And I said, okay, I got the message. I'll take the pumpkins and the black cats and the spooky gothic castles and cobwebs out of it, you know. But yeah, it was still a perfectly good structure for the A plot, B plot, C plot. And I just sort of retooled it as a Star Trek novel called The Weight of Worlds. So I tend to, another reason why I don't tend to talk a lot about my rejected pitches is I barely end up using them.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
I actually had a rejected Firefly outline that I turned into a Terminator novel. Okay, so, you know.
That's, wow. That's quite a...
Sometimes by the time you get to the end of it, there's very resemblance of
the original.
I have tricked myself sometimes into thinking, oh, well, this would be easy. I'll just turn this old Firefly outline. Invariably trying to make the conversion ends up being, you know, you end up far removed from the original idea, you know. But hey, with Farscape, say, and Voyager, honestly, turning 7 of 9 into Aaron's son was not that hard.
True.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that it's neat too. Like, I know you're very connected to the Farscape universe, and that's really neat too. But so you started with Star Trek. It's obvious that you had a connection to the people in it. What was the first tie-in work outside of Star Trek where it got the ball rolling, where you moved on to other franchises?
Okay, prior to Star Trek, I guess my real foot in the door was I did a couple of Batman stories for DC. This would have been, back around the time that the second Tim Burton movie was coming out, Batman Returns. And I got word, because it's a small community, that they were putting out a couple of anthologies, an anthology of Penguin stories and an anthology of Catwoman stories to tie in with the new movie with Danny DeVito and Michelle Pfeiffer. So we heard that DC was taking pitches for these anthologies, and John Betancourt called me, actually. He'd found out about this, but Betancourt did not actually know all that much about it. He was not as much of a comic book aficionado. It was sort of like, hey, Greg, you're a Batman fan, right? Oh, yeah, I'm a Batman fan. I grew up watching Adam West, etc. So why don't we get together this weekend and put together some Penguin and Catwoman pitches, and then we'll submit them to DC. And we did, and we got the stories sold. And again, this did directly lead to Star Trek, because I told John Ordover all about this, and he read the Batman stories and liked them. In fact, I'll mention, we actually wrote 4 stories, though for whatever reason at the time, DC didn't want to put both our names, Betancourt and I, on both stories. So we kind of divvied it up and, okay, I'll take credit for that story, you'll take credit for that story, I'll take credit. So, we wrote 4 stories together, and each of us got the credit for one of them.
And Ordover was a big comic book guy too, so he.
Yes, Ordover, has he told you about the Malibu lunch?
He might have in that interview.
There was at the time a diner on 23rd Street. I think it's still there, the Malibu Diner, that was a block away from our favorite comic book store. And it got to be that all of us sci-fi writers, Lost Star Trek writers, editors, publishers, because again, we're all in New York City, it's a small community. We would all get together every Wednesday and hit the local comic book store, get our comic books, and then head over to the Malibu Diner, where we would argue about last night's episode of Buffy. And at our height, I think the Malibu lunches are still going on, though they've faded a little bit just because of attrition, and we've all grown up, got kids, moved away,
Yeah.
We were getting like 20, 36 people or so showing up every Wednesday. You'd be surprised how much Star Trek business and just general science fiction licensing business went on at the Malibu lunch every Wednesday.
I'm actually not surprised, but
yeah. So, but no, because it was a comic. It was the diner that was across the street from the comic book store. We would go get our comic books, and then we would go to the Malibu Diner and hang out and gossip and network, as they say. So yeah, this was all like the time that John and I were plotting the Eugenics Wars books and everything. We were You talked about how it was sort of a close-knit band. Not everybody was in New York, but there was enough of us, again, that we were literally having lunch, every Wednesday. And getting together and, hey, the new Highlander movie just opened. Let's all get the gang together and go see the movies,
Yeah.
So, there'd be me and Keith DeCandido and, and the gang, and Loran Gilman and Jen Heddle, who's currently at Lucasfilms of Star Wars. We were all hanging out and going to see the new Highlander movie together or whatever,
Oh, that is really cool. Yeah. I'm jealous of your ability to all nerd out together at that time. Speaking of somebody who was living just north of you guys in Syracuse, devouring your books, I would have probably, I told John that 1999 me would have just been blown away that I got to just nerd out with him about the creation of these books, because they were the only fiction I was reading during the period when I was in school, because my brain couldn't handle anything where I didn't already know the characters.
Oh, I can understand that, yeah.
In which, unfortunately for me, in Star Trek, I'm just starting to get back into reading Star Trek novels, because for a long time, and I have to do a lot of reading for our Philip K. Dick podcast. I burned out on Star Trek novels for a lot, because I read so many of them that for many years I was just like, I can't read Star Trek novels. I would read what you guys were doing and I'd be like, oh, that sounds really cool. I just can't do it. And for many years, and actually got back into it by reading Uma McCormick's Picard novel, which was great, and now dipping my toes back into partially because of doing this podcast, but and I'm really excited to get into some of the newer original series stuff that you're doing. And it seems like you've gone back to focusing on the original series. Are those the characters do you feel most comfortable with?
Oh yeah, well, partly, like I said, it's a generational thing. I've watched all the latter-day shows religiously and enjoyed them all to various degrees. But I grew up, on the original series, those original 79 episodes. Those are the ones that are burned into my brain forever. I have dim memories of watching Star Trek during its original run on NBC with my dad. He would let me stay up past my bedtime to watch Star Trek with him.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, then the syndicated reruns were running endlessly throughout what it seems like my entire childhood and life,
Me too.
college and everything. I remember in college, my buddies and I, we would play this game, which would be name that Star Trek episode, where we just sort of tune in, okay, Star Trek's on at 6 o'clock. And how quickly could you identify the episode? And this was a game that was played in nanoseconds. Stardate, Return of the Archons,
Yeah.
Return to Tomorrow,
Yeah.
And I associate, honestly, the movies started coming out in college. College is when I discovered organized fandom. I was sort of an isolated, nerd before then. It was in college when I, thanks to our college science fiction club, that I kind of discovered organized fandom, started going to conventions. And by nice coincidence, this is about when Star Trek came back. When I saw Star Trek Motion Picture with pretty much my entire college Star Trek science fiction club. We took a road trip to Seattle to see the movie because it wasn't playing in our small little college town. I saw The Wrath of Khan while I was in college, so little did I know when I went and saw The Wrath of Khan back in 1982 that someday Khan would take over my life. Okay,
Which is
little did I know when I studied under von McIntyre. There's this weird sort of inevitability. Little did I know that when I studied under Van McIntyre, who wrote the novelization of The Wrath of Khan, that I would end up writing the prequel. Okay,
Right. Well, and
years later,
you're a few years ahead of me, but most of that, what you're saying, I'm right there with you. The motion picture is one of the first movies I remember seeing in the theater. Empire Strikes Back was the only one I remember before it. And so there's not a Star Trek movie that's come out that I haven't seen in the theater on opening day. I was too young to get the motion picture. I just recently rewatched the motion picture, and I have great love for it now, being that it's the most science fiction of all the Star Trek. But Wrath of Khan, special place in my heart, and will always be because it was the one that made me fall in love with the characters and understanding what we're talking about here. The motion, or the Wrath of Khan, more than any other movie when I was younger. Sorry, loud motorcycle outside. The Wrath of Khan, more than any other story early in my childhood and watching it, was one where I understood the arc of a character starting at the beginning of the story and coming to the end, and partially because I had such a relationship with the original series characters that all of it made sense to me. So Wrath of Khan has a special place here. So now your upcoming original series novel, can you give us the pitch? Wait, before you do that though, I do have one question. I'm sorry, I have to do that because I want to come to that one last. You write Batman, you write DC Comics characters, you've written Terminator, Firefly, so many. But there's got to be, is there anything that comes close to the feeling of stepping into the shoes of the characters of Star Trek, or is there anything that comes close to that? Because I know it's got to be like.
Well, I've been lucky. I've gotten to write for a lot of stuff that I have a great nostalgic connection for. Like I mentioned watching Star Trek with my dad as a kid. And I also remember watching the Adam West Batman TV series with my kids. So, there was a part of me that, oh my God, I'm writing Batman is like, I wrote Godzilla. There is a part, this is my job these days, but there is a part of me that is a great big fanboy. So when someone says, oh, Greg, would you like to do Planet of the Apes? Would you like to do Godzilla? Oh, hell yes. I still remember one moment I was writing a DC book. It was a novelization, I think, of Final Crisis for DC. And there's a scene where Wonder Woman is fighting the Frankenstein monster. And I remember actually having this moment, again, you mentioned it, when you were, in Syracuse, if you could have gone and geeked out, if, talking to John Ordover, I think, if I could go back in time and tell, teenage Greg that someday you will be paid to write Wonder Woman fighting the Frankenstein monster, this is so cool, My inner 13-year-old was just, yeah.
Yeah, look, and as somebody, part of the reason why I started this podcast is because I'm a frustrated storyteller that would love to tell Star Trek stories. So I thought breaking down the myths and the arcs and doing that would be fun for me. And that's kind of how it started. I told John, I'm so jealous, especially John, because he had the ability to play with the whole franchise, and work with tons of different writers. Like his ability to spin out stories like the Invasion series or the Captain's Table, those kinds of things. It's incredible that he got that opportunity, and just him talking about it in my brain, I was like, God, that must have been so much fun. Even more than just writing an individual novel, just like his ability to oversee an expanded universe was like really cool. That being said, what's the newest Star Trek novel? What do we have to look forward to?
Deep breath. Okay, so.
Yeah. Hydrate, because
the new book is called A Contest of Principles. It comes out in November. It is done. They actually recorded the audiobook, I think, last week. I was actually exchanging emails with the audiobook people about the correct pronunciation of all the weird alien names. I like to describe this book as my love letter to Dr. McCoy. At this point, I have been writing Star Trek novels for, a quarter of a century, believe it or not. And I'm always looking for what haven't I done yet, or what's new. And it suddenly hit me that as much as I love Dr. McCoy, and Dr. McCoy was great, DeForest Kelley, etc., I had never written a McCoy-centric novel. McCoy's all over my TOS books, bickering with Spock, offering words of wisdom to, Kirk, and, doing medical stuff as needed and being a doctor, damn it, not a whatever, Incidentally, I'm limited. I have been told I'm limited to one. I'm a doctor, not a per book. Okay, those are the rules. I can do one. I'm a doctor, not a whatever book. My favorite is still I'm a doctor, not an exorcist. Okay, but so I wanted to write a book that was very much about McCoy and focused on McCoy, and even where when McCoy is not on scene, he's being talked about. The plot in a nutshell, the Enterprise is on a vital mission when Dr. McCoy vanishes under mysterious circumstances. And suddenly they are sort of torn in different directions. They've got this vital mission, but they also have to find what happened to McCoy. And meanwhile, what's going on with McCoy. If I had really wanted to be kind of flip, I could have called this book Star Trek, The Search for McCoy,
Right.
But there's actually sort of a plot, a B plot, and a C plot. There's 3 planets and 3 storylines. You've got Kirk dealing with this serious political situation on this one planet. You have Spock, who is actually spearheading the mission to find McCoy, accompanied, by the way, by Nurse Chapel, who damn well insists on coming along on the mission to find McCoy. And Chapel, by the way, is another character who I realized I had never really, despite writing Star Trek for 25 years, had not really done much. She'd always been there handing phasers to, scalpels to Mark McCoy. So it was fun to actually, oh, what character have I not really explored much? Oh, Chapel. Let's have fun with Chapel. And then meanwhile we have McCoy, and he's deep in a serious bad situation on another planet, and he's on his own and having to have an adventure of his own. So,
oh, that sounds great. Yeah,
it was sort of the search for McCoy, and it was a book about wanting to do a book about, okay, McCoy's missing, we got to find McCoy, and how much does McCoy mean to people? So, and let him sort of take center stage for at least a third of the book,
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is really cool. Yeah, I really look forward to it. And it's interesting too, because you have been writing Star Trek books for 25 years. So finding that edge or that thing that you want to do. And I'm a huge Bones fan. I always look forward to stories that are focused on him. And really, I think, a couple of the writers have nailed McCoy, but there's still fertile ground. I think Michael Jan Friedman wrote a couple really good McCoy novels, but I think you're right. There's a lot more Spock novels, and there's a lot more Kirk focus.
And it's not even deliberate. It kind of came as a shock to me to realize, wait, I've never actually written a McCoy-centric novel. He's always just been sort of there as part of the Holy Trio, but I've written Kirk-centric books and Spock-centric books, and never. Oh, it's.
Mm-hmm.
And very much like there's a sort of a sense too, and I'm actually hyping the Chapel thing because I didn't realize that the Chapel thing was going to. I'm getting a lot of positive feedback in advance from people. Wait, Chapel's in this book? You read about? Yeah, Chapel's in this book, and Chapel actually has a lot to do in this book. So people seem to be actually excited about that because she's probably a character who's been neglected a little bit.
Now,
God knows I've probably neglected Chapel, a bit,
McCoy's missing. Is Mabenga in it?
Yes, he is. I think he is. Yes, he is, because Mabenga is the person I bring in when you need medicine people to be treated. Mabenga is definitely in it.
Okay.
Because life goes on, and sickbay does not shut down because McCoy is missing, and Kirk is dealing with this dire situation, and people get busted up, people get hurt, and people need to get beamed to sickbay, and Mabenga is there. So, it's kind of like Charlene Masters. Charlene Masters from The Alternative Factor? She's my default character I go to in engineering when Scotty can't be in two places at once. Now
offline, I have joked with Ordiver about, and I know I would want you to be on this panel, but I've joked about doing a panel of trying to, with a couple of original series experts, to determine, have a big showdown with each person, like Perry Mason style, representing what they think is the worst original series episode and arguing for their episode. And Ordiverse claims that he would do the alternate factor. And I had this idea of one person representing that one representing Spock's brain or whatever. And we all.
Turnabout intruder.
Yes, exactly. And who can determine which is the, and Ordiver kept saying the alternate factor just makes absolutely zero sense at all. And it's amazing that you mined a character from it in order to make
again, sometimes it's like doing things that, lost potential, like the fact we never got the further adventures of Gary Seven. Mm-hmm. Charlene Masters is interesting because of we all know that episode had a troubled history and went through a lot of,
Mm-hmm.
She ended up being very wasted in that episode. In fact, there's no real particular reason for her to be in that episode, except at one point she had a whole plot line that got cut out,
Yeah.
But sometimes, Scotty can't be everywhere at once. Sometimes you need somebody on the bridge at the engineering station, or you need somebody down there, or Scotty's on the away mission. So if I need to sort of cut to engineering and have somebody sitting at the engineering station on the bridge while Scotty's down trying to keep the warp core from blowing up, or is down on the planet having been captured by Klingons, I tend to go to Charlene Masters as my default, So.
And one thing that, as far as, I think Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens were the masters of the functioning of the Enterprise, and they were really good at thinking those things out. How much time have you spent with the technical manuals, like trying to figure out exactly how the ship works? Probably a lot of hours of your life.
Yeah, if we could swing the camera over, you would see a whole shelf of the Star Trek Encyclopedia, the Star Trek Chronology, the technical manuals. Hang on just a second here. Do I have them? I don't know. But yes, all the various, I've got a complete set of the old Star Trek magazine that had all the cutaway diagrams. I've got the issue that has there's one issue that had a listing of all the other named crewmen on the Enterprise in the 79 episodes, like Charlie Masters and, whatever. No, I've got, hell, I got my new issue of Star Trek magazine in this week, and I'm reading it, the current one,
That's
I actually have 2 copies of the Star Trek Encyclopedia. One is my backup copy in case anything ever happens to the other one.
and I'm sure you've got notes written throughout the whole thing, and just like
somewhere actually I made up a list of all the alien races like mentioned during TOS that are known to the Federation. So if I just have a bar scene and I want to mention you don't always want to do, an Andorian or a Tellarite, who else is there, who you can bring in,
Absolutely.
but who is not a species that is not mentioned until TNG, so no Bajorans, Cardassians, Betazoids, all that. But we don't know when they were met.
We don't know when they met him. Right. All right. So, Greg, that was a really awesome discussion about what it's like to write Star Trek novels. I think that I'm intending to have a lot more of your colleagues on in the near future. Your David Max, your Dayton Wards, but you were my first Star Trek author as a request from John Ordiver, that he said that you got to talk to Greg right away. And it's been a great joy for me. I'm a big fan of especially the Eugenics Wars novels, and Assignment Eternity are tops for me. I'm really looking forward to your McCoy novel. And you're currently on spec writing an original novel. Do you want to tease anything of that, or you want to keep it?
I don't want to jinx that. I've barely mentioned anything to my agent about that even. It's sort of like, I want to see what I get here. So I'm working on it. It's still sort of a work in progress. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's cool. And I'm excited to see what you come up with. And
I will mention, just to support various projects, I do have another thing coming out in October. There's a book called Musings on Monsters. It's being published by, I think, Seacourt. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. It's a collection of essays on classic horror themes coming out in time for Halloween. And I contributed an essay on Boris Karloff and Mia Lugosi. Mm-hmm. And its book is called Musings on Monsters. And it's coming out in October. And it's got essays on Dark Shadows and Frankenstein and mummies and Godzilla and all that. And by coincidence, as we speak here, the final galley proofs for it arrived in my inbox, which they want me to proofread now. So for my essay, so
awesome.
That's what I'll be doing this week at some point.
We need a horror novel from you too, Greg. I think
I did 4 underworld novels.
You did do that, and
yes, I would like to write more horror. I had a ball writing the underworld novels, and it's been a while since I've done horror.
Yeah, that would be good. Speaking as a horror guy, I would love to see those too. But I really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us on Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs. I think the Star Trek storytellers out there just really love to. Well, I really like the idea that I think that the Star Trek fans who consume the stories need to hear a little bit about what it takes to construct the stories from the people who write them in a longer form, to see like what it takes to work in this franchise, because sometimes it can be easy to throw darts at the board and say, I liked this, I didn't like this. And I think it's good to see like how much work is put in behind the scenes.
There's a process.
Yes, there is. So thanks for joining me, and I'll talk to you a bit offline when we are done recording, but I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks a lot. It was great being on.
Okay.